Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Calvinism in America. Actually, I'm not sure how to title this one, so it may be not called that on the lecture title, but Calvinism in America is the subject, and this is in the continuing series on the cultural history of the United States. Before we begin, I want to mention one, thanks for the questions. They were great questions coming in. I really appreciate that, and I'm having fun with the question and answer session, so please keep those coming. And two, do have still some room in my class in France on 9th, 10th, and 11th of October. All of the information is up on my website. You can't pay yet because I haven't figured out how to do that, but I'm working on that. But if you're interested or have more questions, please just send me an email and I'll put you on the list of people who've said they want to sign up, because those people are on that list. Thank you to those folks. And hopefully we'll get a few more and the class will be full and everything will be all systems go. So thanks to everybody who has signed up and for the questions, etc., now available on the website link below. So everything we've talked about so far, and again, where do you begin on these sorts of things? Broad questions like democracy in America and Calvinism in America and cultural history of America. All these questions are pretty broad, and so it's hard to know exactly where to start, of course. But one of the major themes we're looking at is Calvinism and its huge influence on American cultural history. If you are American, born and raised in the United States, or been there a long time, then chances are, basically you are a Calvinist. You don't know you're a Calvinist. You don't mean to be a Calvinist. You've never been to church of any kind. You certainly don't know who Calvin is, probably. So, and yet, oh my gosh, it is so pervasive. It's in the water. It's in the air. They give it to you in your school lunches. It's just one of these fundamental elements that's just everywhere, and we don't recognize it because we don't think of the influence of things like Puritanism and Calvinism as being so strongly prevalent, however they are. But just without the religion, it turns out you can have them without the religion. So, to begin with a little theology, nothing better than starting with a little theology, to background of Calvinism and why it's so important and how it came to the United States. So where do you start with Christian theology? But let's start with Thomas Aquinas, because he's such a great guy. And he's the one that really locked in the idea, which was not original or clear, at least to the early church fathers, that the world is fallen and we are hopelessly filled with sin, right? So that humans are just horrible and degraded and the world is an awful, terrible place. And the best we can do is get out of here as quickly as possible. So, obviously a Catholic thinker, but this was a very influential concept. But it reads differently in Catholicism than in Protestantism, which we'll talk about in a second. So then you get fast forward through a few pages of, theological history. And then you get the reforms of Luther, the birth of Protestantism and the Protestant Reformation, which is a true revolution. I'm never convinced the American Revolution is actually a revolution, because the same people were in power, the same land didn't change, all these sorts of things. The banks didn't change, all that. The Reformation, the Protestant Reformation, was a dramatic, radical break in the history of Western civilization. And Luther was one of the main actors, of course. And what's important to understand about Luther, many things, but one is that he freed people from the domination and control of the Catholic Church. So in some ways, you can read it as a liberation movement, because you had this system in place of Catholic control of just about every aspect of your life. If you're going to be born, you don't really count until you're registered in the church. If you're going to get married, you have to go to the church. Often, if you want to do something with a job, that's going to be through the church. Licenses were granted, records were kept, taxes were paid. Just the church was sort of the center. Hospital, social activities, social care, education. All these systems that we now think of as being secular were at the time carried out by the Catholic Church throughout much of Europe. And so when Luther breaks from Catholicism and the Protestant Reformation gets rolling, this is not a small deviation. This is not a theological dispute, or not just a theological dispute. It ends up being a fundamental transformation of the structures of power in the communities that converted to Protestantism. There was no other way to do it. So, but this created some significant problems, because in Catholicism, you knew you were doing okay because you went to confession and you said, well, I did these bad things, or I might have done something bad, or what do you think of this? And the priest would say, okay, yeah, well, that's not too good. Do some penance of some kind, assuming you haven't been doing terrible, terrible things, something reasonable. And so you would do that and you go, okay, I know I'm doing the right thing. I know I'm doing the right thing because I keep talking to my priest, or at least theoretically, if I wanted to, I could. And so then, of course, there's all the people who on their deathbed confess a bunch of sins, and then they're forgiven. And so you're like, okay, I know either I am continually making myself good because I'm talking to my priest and paying attention and doing these things, or I at least have the possibility of making myself good, right? I know I can get myself in line with my values. Well, with the Lutheran and Calvinist revolution, you get this very different relationship to God. For them, you are entering a position where it's an individual relationship between you and God, and you don't know whether or not you are doing the right things. And so the question is I'm free now. I'm free to believe how I want. I'm free in theory to do what I want. But how do I know I'm doing things that aren't going to get me damned to hell? Because that's sort of bad. Again, no, people aren't becoming atheists at this point because it's sort of not really much of a functional concept, but they still want to be in good with the church. They just want a new church, a different church, a better, a different way to worship. And so this created a big problem for people because they wanted, how do I know? Do I just, what do I do? And one of the responses, well, not one of the responses, multiple examples of this, people set up communities. One of them is a community that Calvin set up in Geneva. This became one of the most influential, but wasn't the only one. This happened all over the place, many examples of this. And in Geneva, he tried to create the perfect society in which you were free to have your conscience and think what you wanted without the interference of the priests. However, it was an incredibly rule-bound surveillance state. And so here's the key doctrines of Calvinism and how this was put into place in Geneva, and then how that plays out in America. Like I said, a little theological background here, always good for us. So there's more key concepts in Calvinism, but the ones that really matter for how this plays out in the U.S. cultural history is, one is total depravity. People are fallen. The world is fallen. People are fallen. You're terrible. You're horrible, and there's nothing you can do about it. Right? There's you're just the nature of the world. Total depravity. The only chance you have is by God's grace. So this is what you're hoping for. If God, by His grace, decides that even though you're totally awful and wrong in every way, He decides to save you, then okay, you're good. Otherwise, you're no good. So part of this theory of total depravity is a few people God has chosen. Of course, God knows the past, the present, and the future. So these people are born already, God having decided that they're worth saving. So these are the elect, or the saved. These are the those who are beloved of God, right? So you got total depravity, you're awful, horrible, and terrible. But some people, for whatever reason, God is mysterious, God has decided that He's going to save them. And that is huge, right? Like, this makes you a very special person indeed. Two, you have a personal relationship with God. Again, I'll keep emphasizing this because this is, think individualism. When you're in a system of Catholicism, or a system like Catholicism, where you have an intermediary between you and God, you have to belong to the community that intermediary respects, or else you're excommunicated. This, what excommunicated meant, was not that you've been cut off from God. It's been you've been cut off from everything. You've been exiled, essentially. You no longer get to talk to the priest, which means you're necessarily damned to hell. So this is, super bad, and nobody wants to have anything to do with you. You're out of the community, excommunity, right? That's you're gone. And so when you have a personal relationship with God, in theory, this can happen. In practice, of course, this can happen perfectly well, but in theory, this cannot happen. So the elect live in communities where they try to deal with the fact that they're all totally deprived, but they're pretty sure that they've been saved by God through their personal relationship. So these are the key elements here. And so Calvin sets up a community in Geneva. It's like takes him 2 tries. But by the way, he's a French guy, but who's fleeing because of the wars of Reformation. So he flees to Geneva, ends up there, and he starts setting up a community. And he's pretty successful at this because it turns out he combines sort of religious zealotry with incredibly good administrative skills, which is a rare combination. And so, but this community is built on this notion of continual confession of all your failings, of which there are many, and public surveillance. It's a surveillance state. So everybody is watching everybody all the time to make sure everybody else is doing the right things. That's going to make sure that we're all living in a community of the elect, and because that's what makes it really good. So we wouldn't think of this as being a particularly liberated position, right? This sounds like horribly oppressive. And I believe it's true that in Geneva, you weren't allowed to have curtains because people needed to be able to look in your house at any time. And so, these kinds of rules. When I say surveillance state, I mean, a surveillance state. People would turn you in if you seemed not to be behaving appropriately, if you weren't contributing to the community, if you were committing any of the sins like sloth or wrath or lust. This is instantly going to be reported to the authorities. And so, it was a very carefully policed and monitored society. And so on one hand, very orderly and very stable and very consistent. On the other hand, we would consider this incredibly oppressive. And, again, wouldn't want to live necessarily in this surveillance state in theory. So this idea, and because of the success of Geneva and because of Calvin's success in administering and creating this, and so many Protestant thinkers visited or experienced or were writing that with people in the community, that there are people like, wow, this is hugely important. So fast forward there to the United States and the early colonies. And so the Puritans were, essentially the inheritors of the Calvinist tradition who wanted to set up new Genevas. They wanted to set up new communities where the godly people, the right people living the right way, could all live together, and they could reinforce and make stable this saved place. And they thought of America as this exceptional opportunity and this gift from God. And so America was, it was American exceptionalism again, that this is the land of the chosen, of the elect. And we are going to live here, and we are going to build the communities, the shining cities on the hill, to use Winthrop's phrase, which is also many Catholic writers before had talked about this. The Greeks had talked about this, but it was this, the shining city on the hill that will be a beacon of perfect living, where the elect live, and they live correctly, and they're a model for other people, and God will grace them, and they'll be the chosen ones who will be bringing all the grace and benefits and glory of God on earth as they get prepared to be ascended into heaven. This is the goal. This is what the Puritans are about. And if you read the early writers like Winthrop, this is not a subtle attempt to read the tea leaves and go, oh, they're kind of suggesting this. No, they're just saying this absolutely dead flat out. And you mix this with this concept, though. So now you have to imagine you have these Puritan communities who are living under these Calvinist concepts and making them real, because they're in a real new world. I mean, Calvin was doing it in Geneva, but many, many different colonies were setting up these malls, and different cities were trying to set this up all over the New World. Not just this, but there was a lot of this. Estimates are something like 80% of Europeans who came to the New World were Protestants. So there were Catholics, and was it New Hampshire that was founded as a Catholic colony? Anyway, one of the colonies was founded specifically as a Catholic colony. So again, it's not just this model of Puritanism, but it was the dominant one, and it was consistent. Even when people didn't believe it or whatever, these communities were around. You're being influenced by these ideas. You're running into them. Pennsylvania, of course, the Quakers are founding Pennsylvania. So again, another religious movement. So there's a lot of religious turmoil and ferment and theology going on. But underneath this is this notion of, oh, we're building a new place. We're going to make it perfect. This is our opportunity as God's chosen people to create a new, just, godly world. However, and this is where the Cotton Mather and this thing comes along. If you're familiar with the Salem witch trials, what's important about the Salem witch trials, many things important about it, but for this lecture, is within this context, you have people trying to build these communities. These are the communities of the godly, of the elect, who are going to live correctly, gain the grace of God, although theologically that's a very dubious position. But anyway, you work hard, you're seen to work hard, you're a benefit to the community, you're an upright person. That's how you know you're elect. That's how you know you're in a good relationship with God. Therefore, your chance of being saved goes way up. However, there's these other people about who aren't living right, who aren't doing it right. Now, these people are, we're going to call them in this case, witches. And the threat of the witch is not that they're living differently. It's that they are going to poison the entire experiment. Because if people don't live correctly, then you become threatened that with the punishment of God, because God is going to punish everybody for not living the right way. Your community will be poisoned. It only takes a few witches. They're going to steal your children. They're going to seduce your wife. They're going to make people do wrong things. And then God is going to smite us. And it only takes a few, 1, 2, or 3 of these people, and our entire community, our whole project, our entire city on a hill will come crashing down because of God's wrath and God's anger. Because remember, we're all terrible and fallen. And so it's a knife edge all of the time. Like this is it. And so when you read something like was it called The Invisible World, Creature of the Invisible World? But basically the title of Mather's work on the Salem witch trials is The Invisible World something. Now I can't remember what. Sorry, I should have looked this up again. But the idea here is this: there's always this threat. It's an invisible threat, but every once in a while you can suss it out. It rears its head, and these are witches. And if you grab them and you punish them and you torture them, eventually they'll confess to being witches. And then, of course, you were right the whole time. And that saves the community. So you're not doing this to save the witches, by the way, because they're hopeless and depraved. You're doing it to save the community. And the community is always threatened by just a few people, 1 or 2 individuals or 3 individuals who are not living right. So, very quick run on the theology of Calvinism and how it gets transported in the New World, and some key thinkers like Winthrop and Mather who basically expand and export these ideas into the New World. But I say city on the hill, but it's important to note that JFK, for instance, Ronald Reagan gave speeches about the United States being a city on the hill, and that you're building the city on the hill using the language quite knowingly, the language of Winthrop, because and who was using early theological texts. So this goes right back, and their ideas, both JFK and Reagan, who were not really say political allies, natural political allies as it were, but they had similar ideas here, which was the United States is a moral place, and if we live morally and set a moral example in the world, then other people will be drawn to live correctly and be a democracy and do it the way the United States does. And therefore, our morality will transform the world. And if we aren't moral, if we're depraved, then our project fails and we drag down the world with us. I mean, it's really just straight, Winthropism, Calvinism. I mean, it's Puritanism. It's straight. And both JFK and Reagan use this language, and everybody goes, "Oh yeah, that's great. Yeah, absolutely. This is." The U.S. is a moral actor on the world stage, which, of course, anybody knows anything about diplomatic power, politics, and history knows this is of very limited accuracy, let us say. Not that we shouldn't try to do things, but, right things. But, yeah, it's always a bit of a muddle out there. Rarely do you get moral clarity in international affairs. It tends to be a bunch of unpleasant trade-offs. But the notion that no, we should live upright, that we should be the pure people, and that if we're the pure people, we'll set the worlds to right, and God will bless us, and we will be the exceptional country that makes everybody else come to the light, right? This is our goal. So hugely influential concepts. So many new countries or many new cities are founded, states, Utah, right? What are the Mormons doing? They're heading off to start a new colony that's going to live right? I mean, this is the oldest story in some ways in the Calvinist tradition. It just happened over and over and over. Much, not all, but much of the westward expansion was free land. Hey, that's great. New opportunity, that's great. But part of it is, hey, let's go someplace where we can finally set up the community that we've always wanted. Right? Like this is one of the impulses behind some of this, not all of this, of course, but behind some of this. And when new communities start to be set up, there's often a second wave where these sorts of religious people during the awakening and stuff in the 18th century and 19th century come in and say, okay, now we're going to clean this up. Now we're going to get this godly. Now we're going to make this place a shining city on the hill. We're going to build the new utopia. That's, these ideas go way back, but it was consistently on this Calvinist and puritanical model in the United States. But then something funny happens on the way to the forum, as it were. And if you listen to the series, you'll see why I started with this notion of individualism and the importance of people moving consistently and moving out. So the original model for these communities were surveillance communities. But what this meant was you can't have a lot of strangers around. They have to be fairly static, and they have to have very well-defined borders. Because you can't have a successful surveillance community when you don't have clear borders, when people are coming and going wildly, so on and so forth. So that model just erodes rapidly in the United States under a couple of things. One is, if you don't like what's going on in your city, you can just leave in the United States, because there's all kinds of places going, lots of booming, lots of opportunity, lots of migration, lots of moving, lots of everything going on. And so it was much harder to sort of quote unquote discipline people, because they would just often up and leave. Not that they didn't do plenty of it, but there was also a long history in the United States of people going, you know what, you're a religious nutter, I'm outie. And so that problem was one. And so these communities tend to diffuse pretty quickly. And so they became sort of popularity contests, which of course means you've got to alter your approach to try and stay popular with the people. You can't be too ferocious and so on and so forth. The second thing that happens is you get communities that are filled with strangers. And so in a community of relative strangers or increasing number of strangers where everything is flexible, there's no stir borders, there's no good way to maintain surveillance, the actual benefit of this falls apart or begins to weaken significantly, which is, remember back to Luther, hey, now I'm free to do, but how do I know I'm doing the right thing? I don't have anybody who tells me I'm doing the right thing and helps me when I'm doing the wrong thing. I don't know how I know. And what happened in Puritanism in the United States is there was a slow morphing where a lot of the surveillance and community reinforcement turned into what is essentially prosperity doctrine. Well, you know you're the member of the elect if you're working hard and doing right things and you're prosperous. Because this means, of course, God is blessing you. Because if God wasn't blessing you, you wouldn't be prosperous. I mean, the logic here is obviously flawless. So the blessings of prosperity made you appear like you weren't just a prosperous merchant who was doing well. You're actually the chosen person of God. You're a member of the elect. And so this created an environment where not only did you want to be prosperous, always a popular option, but that being prosperous made you appear as if you were upright and morally responsible and trustworthy. Now, you can read a lot of theological history in Europe, and there is very low association with rich people being moral, right? Say what you will about Catholic theology, but that was not one they got that confused about. They were perfectly clear that a lot of these bastards who had a bunch of money were not that morally upright. In fact, they maintained incredible suspicion about this. Many Catholic sects, renounced all wealth, and they, so this was a constant ongoing battle within the Catholic Church, because people were like, yeah, no, you could be wealthy and a bastard. That's not a problem. But in the U.S., this transmogrifies into a place where to be wealthy was to be seen to be upright, but upright in the way of like Calvinists. Like you're a member of the elect. You're a chosen child of God. You're a special person. And so you already have this strong impulse towards material wealth because it's surrounded all the reasons that we've already talked about. And you have this incredible impetus towards individualism. And so here is a religious system whose implications, again, this isn't like the direct theology, but the clear implications of it are, one, as an individual, you are responsible to God. Two, that only, or the best way to know whether or not God is really thinking you're doing well is that if you get wealthy or prosperous, because this is the main feedback that you're able to have anymore, because you're not in a surveillance community. The less stable the community, the less, direct feedback you can get from people who are in positions of authority. Plus, we don't like people to be in positions of authority. Didn't we get rid of that with the Protestant Reformation? That sort of problem is gone. And by the way, I do want to emphasize again, when Calvin was setting up Geneva, this was an articulated and recognized problem. They weren't, it was clear immediately that they were going, hey, I'm free, but I need to make sure I'm doing the right thing. I want to be right by God, right? So I don't want to mess that up. And so how do I know? And Calvin's like, hey, here's how you know. We'll create doctrines that let you know you're doing the right thing. We do these confessions. People monitor you. Your neighbors will tell you if you're doing wrong. Your priest will help you out, right? We're all doing this together so that we can create an upright community. Again, the shining city on the hill. And so now you get this bizarre Never Never Land, where it is the Calvinist fundamentals of the American religious experience that underwrites the notion that being wealthy proves that you're doing the right thing. And so you're seen as being bright, living correctly, and being special, being elect of God, if you are successful and wealthy in whatever way. And so it's just this, again, you can see how odd this is, but it sort of amplifies what were already native elements in the American cultural experience to an incredible degree. And this is why, if you wonder why America is so intense about wealth, by the way, not just wealth, but being seen to be wealthy. Because notice what you're trying to replace. You're trying to replace a sense of you're doing the right thing by community reinforcement, because you don't have the priests anymore. So you need community reinforcement to tell you you're doing the right thing, but you don't live in communities where you're known as an individual nearly as much as you did in a city like Geneva. So with strangers and all this, you need to adopt dress codes. You need to have material possessions. You need to live in the kinds of houses that allow you to be seen to be the right kind of person. And so it's like, oh, that's incredible, right? Like, so this creates these patterns that we see. In fact, there's demographic studies and cultural studies. Now I'm trying to remember, there's a book, I should have looked this up, it just popped in my mind. But I read it years ago, and they talked about different class levels in the United States, and they said only the wealthiest and oldest money build houses that you can't see. Everybody else in the United States, you can be poor, you can be middle class, you can be upper middle class, you can be really, really rich, new rich. They tend to build houses on average. If they have houses, they can afford a house to build a house that can be seen. Even when they spend a couple of $1 million on a big piece of land, they want it to be seen because to be seen, this is community reinforcement. There's no point in building a house that people can't actually see anymore. Of course, this has changed, I think, in the recent years. I'd be interested to see if there's a follow-up on this with social media where everybody takes pictures of everything. But you can see what social media is doing is just extending this. It's saying, oh, okay, it's not enough to go to a nice restaurant and have an experience that makes you feel good, but you have to have people see you doing this, because then you get the community reinforcement that you're living correctly, that you are the elect of God. Otherwise, how would you know? You wouldn't. It's terrifying. We're out there on our own. And so this individualism, this emphasis on individualist relationship with God creates this need to have this community reinforcement. However, it also reinforces the notion of individualism. You're not responsible for your community anymore. And God is anyway. Like, there's nothing you can do. It's a question of the elect. So other wealthy people are members of the elect, but it's because of their relationship to God and what they've done, not because of anything you've done, because that's not your responsibility. They're responsible for them. You're not responsible for them. So it also has this, again, sort of, we'll talk about this next time. I think I'm going to do a lecture on libertarianism, in which contributes massively to this libertarian impulse. And so all of this boils through in various guises that you wouldn't necessarily expect. But I just wanted to give you some examples of how pervasive the Calvinist doctrine is in the U.S. and the U.S. way of thinking. And so you go, all right, so one of my favorite ones, because it's so bad and so clear, is this notion of white guilt. And this is the idea, if you're born in America and you're white, well, you're guilty for things like, say, slavery, or in other countries like colonialism, right? You're responsible for colonialism, even if, how would you be responsible for colonialism? And the beautiful thing here is this goes all the way back to St. Thomas Aquinas, of course, but this is, the modern Puritan Calvinist version of just being born as a white baby makes you wrong, right? You are born fallen. Also, there's nothing you can do about it. There is no salvation. See, that's the thing. In Catholicism, let's say all this is true, you would go to the priest and say, hey, I was born white and my ancestors maybe had slaves or maybe not, I don't know. And go say 5 Hail Marys and everything's good. And so you could do that and you're good. And you're like, yeah, I feel better. That's great. I don't have to worry about that. Moving along, right? No, this is a Calvinist system where you're a sinner, you're fallen, and there's absolutely nothing you can do about it, because that's just the state of humanity. The best thing you can do is confess. This is just Calvinism, pure Calvinism here, or Puritanism if you want, and admit that you're hopelessly corrupt. And then the community that you're in will recognize that as an act of contrition and go, okay, as long as you keep being contrite, right? There's no end to contrition, by the way, because you're hopelessly fallen. And so you just have to keep going along. And so you get this a lot. I would say this is one of the more left-wing flavors that you get of this, which is like, oh my gosh, this just powerful impulse to try and make you feel guilty about things for which you have no control and for which you can do nothing about, which is pure Calvinism. Well, Adam and Eve, so you're screwed. You're like, well, I don't remember suggesting an apple. Was it an apple? What the hell's going on? Right? No, you are guilty, and there's nothing you can do about it. Pure Puritan. But again, this was not Catholicism, because Catholicism, you just said, okay, you went to your priest, waved it away. On the right, you see this in a lot of places, with the fear of whatever the group that's going to mess everything up. Let's say it's homosexuals. We don't like homosexuals, so we're going to say, so again, homosexuality, who cares, whatever, right? Like, okay, I don't agree with it. Maybe I even think it's a sin. Fine. But I don't care, because the people that I'm worried about, they just go to the priest. The priest takes care of that. That's the priest's job. The priest says, say some Hail Marys. And then you say some Hail Marys and think, hey, you're good to go, right? Like, okay, great. That's fine. My community is taken care of. I don't have to worry about it. But when you don't have priests around to intervene on these things, then what do? You're in this really awkward space where, this is a threat. And so homosexuality is not a threat to individuals. It's not a threat to whatever. It's the sin that will bring down and destroy the entire system. And so you see this all the time when you see, talking points like gay marriage in the United States. It's like, well, what do you care? Like, who cares? Like, this is sort of the knee-jerk reaction. It's like, but it's the threat. It's going to destroy America because it's witches, right? That's basically, it's just Cotton Mather. Fast forward a few hundred years, it's just pure Cotton Mather. And I'm like, wow, look, Cotton Mather is back. And so this is what I find so fascinating, is the prevalence and power of these Calvinist and puritanical traditions. Now, if we go back to the left, again, both sides agree on this. This is how powerful it is that you get this just pure stream flavor of these traditions from both spectrums of the political party. On the left, this version is more personal usually. It's like, oh, okay, so if you do, again, I mentioned this before, but if you're a lovely person, you're a pillar of your community, you pay your taxes, your kids are good, you try to be a loving husband or wife, and, blah, blah, but you're just a racist asshole, right? But you don't bother anybody. You're just like, I just don't like those people, whoever they are, whatever race I don't like them. Like there's this theory that, oh, you're an awful human being, right? It's any small taint destroys everything. It's these purity wars, and both left and right love purity wars because this is what Puritanism and Calvinism is all about. Making sure we're all pure and we're all together in a community that agrees on what purity is, and that we're all monitoring each other to make sure that nobody slips up on the purity. And so, yeah, you get to, again, both sides do this. It's amazing. Another version of this, and then I'll move on, is you get this question of who should benefit from public things. And the answer is the worthy, right? It's the elect. Godly things are for the elect. And if you give resources or time or attention to people who are not members of the elect, then you're going against God's will, and you're going to threaten the whole community, so on and so forth. And so when you look at things like, who should get college funding? So the right says, who should get college funding? The worthy, who are the smartest, the hardest working, or whatever. Or maybe there should be none whatsoever. It's just for the wealthy, because that's how God chooses who should get to go to college, is because their parents have the resources to send them to college. So the left says, no. They want it to go to the deserving poor, right? These are the people who need the assistance the most, and so we should reach out to the deserving, not the undeserving poor, by the way. No one wants to give anything to the quote-unquote undeserving poor. That's a bad idea. But it's like, if you make too much money, well, then those resources should be spared for other people because it's not for you. Or if you have, right, this is all the selection, right, of the right people who get the right resources. So maybe if you're a first generation, like if none of your family has gone to college before, there are special programs that say, it's really good if we give the money to those people, right? They've never had the opportunity to go in their family history to go to college. So that's where the resource, they're the deserving and worthy poor. So it's always about this selecting of deservedness and worthiness. And if you just want to contrast you can read like Boccaccio's Decameron or the Canterbury Tales from two different societies, but both of these are what I would call classically Catholic works. They're very earthy, they're very funny. You get this just crazy mix of people and stories, their body, they're hilarious. They have sometimes a moral redeeming code. Generally, they don't have a moral redeeming code. You tend to have a broad swath of societies, particularly in the Canterbury Tales. They're all kind of bumbling along together, and all kinds of great things come up. But that's it. Within a Catholic world, you can have this sort of greater range of humor and human failings and quote-unquote sins and ignorances and hilarity, because there is a recourse. You can go to the priest. They make this all good. They sort of square the circle on all this, and so it's all fine. There is no equivalent in puritanical writing to a Boccaccio or a Canterbury Tales. Like there's no, like they always have a serious moral, educational, theological goal. And because otherwise it would be just being funny or just being entertaining or just, celebrating human diversity. See, that's wrong. That's bad. And so the flavor here is amazing. And so what this translates to is all these, crazy elements of our contemporary American culture that seem odd and almost inexplicable if you don't have this kind of background. So one is, with radical American individualism, which has a religious theological underpinning, by the way, as we've just discussed, why do we live in a society of such ill, unhealthy people? You would think, oh, we're all obsessed with ourselves. Why don't we all just be super healthy psychologically, emotionally, physically? This is what we want. But instead, by, every standard, we're not doing that. Look at whatever number you want. We certainly haven't achieved that kind of situation. Again, if you go back and read classic Greek literature, which I always recommend, oh my God, one thing that jumps out at you, they loved themselves. They absolutely loved themselves. And they were obsessed, obsessed with their physical, moral, intellectual, and emotional health. They talk about it ad nauseum, even when it's not the philosophers talking. Like, people are like, no, this is, they're always, like I said, I think half of Socratic dialogues take place on the way to the gym, at the gym, or on the way home from the gym. Because they were exercising, they wanted to take care of themselves. Of course, it's not universal, but as a cultural goal and ideal, they absolutely had this. You should take care of yourself. You should be physically fit. Vitality was seen as proof that you were actually someone worth listening to. Because why would you listen to anybody who wasn't physically and emotionally and intellectually vital? That made no sense to them. Like, well, if you're sick in some way, obviously you're not very bright, right? Like, you don't love yourself enough and you're not taking care of yourself. So why would I listen to you? Like, you're a sick person. Why listen to sick people? To them, this didn't seem confusing. It's very confusing to us. And so you go, wow, like, how do you have a society of theoretically self-obsessed people who are so clearly unwell on so many categories, statistical categories you want to look at? Answer, Calvinism. So because the world has fallen and because you're, irredeemably evil, you cannot trust yourself. You must hate yourself. You must doubt everything about yourself. And I believe it's Cotton Mather's father who writes about, if you enjoy it, it's wrong. You're doing it wrong. And so this is why, like, the no pain, no gain idea is like, wow, if you're in pain, then you're gaining. Right? That's pure. This is again, this is just pure Calvinism. You're just hitting the pipe on the Calvin there. It's so hilarious. I find it hilarious, but also disturbing at times, because the notion that you can just experience joy and learn that way doesn't seem to occur to people. We actually don't have it as a social concept, as far as I can tell. However, there's a lot of psychological research that suggests you learn best, you have better retention and better memory when you're relaxed, when you're enjoying yourself. Because the stress prevents you. We all know this, right? If you stress out on a test, you do terrible, right? Like, this is the classic. Like, you study, you try to learn, you get stressed and you go blank. And you're like, oh my God, I know this, but I'm stressed out. So, like, just relax. This is what they tell you. Just relax, get a good night's sleep, and everything. You'll do so much better. Don't worry about it. Let go of be very Buddhist, like meditate, whatever. Right? That concept, though, that all there's not a little bit. There's a lot of research that says, yeah, it's just true. Like, you learn better, you retain better, and you have more fun. And if you're enjoying yourself, right? If you're not enjoying yourself, particularly if you feel like you're under stress or threat, it's harder to learn. You learn more slowly and you retain less well. So all of this suffering and pain and stuff is sort of counterproductive at the least, right? So, but we love this idea. We absolutely love this idea, because we just do not trust ourselves. We need outside verification. Now, when you need outside verification, you have to do things that outside people can see or judge or rate or put a score on, so that you can know you're a good person. So if you're faced with a choice, a binary choice, let's simplify for a moment, where I go, oh, I can do what I want, or I can do something that's going to give me positive feedback from the people who are watching me. We go, which is not unnatural, by the way, we're social creatures. We go, well, let's go for the positive feedback. So I'm going to do something that doesn't feel good to me, but I think will get me some notification in my community so that I might become a member of the elect. right? Like this is my goal. So I can feel like I'm a member of the elect. And so we tend to be pretty damn happy to just torture ourselves so that we can create some sort of sense of ourselves as mattering, as belonging, as being accepted by God, even though we're operating in a world in which the theory is one of total depravity, that in fact you are not worthy, you are fallen, and you are worthless. And so rarely do I say this, but one way to think about, kind of like on the last question and answer, I said, one way to kind of conceptualize working against our materialism is to say, what can I stop doing? What can I not buy? What am I buying now that I can stop buying that might help address any problem that you encounter? It may not work, but if you think about that first, it's a way of fighting that. With Calvinism, one of the best thought experiments I've been able to come up with for fighting this is to just say over and over again, basically, like, no, I'm good, I'm worthy, right? I'm a good, worthy person. That I don't need to do anything to make myself good and worthy. I mean, maybe not do things will make you more good, but just, you just are. Like, your existence makes you fine and worthy. But man, we cannot have this. So you can't this just, again, talk to people about their kids or how school is all structured. It's not like, hey, I'm good. I'm just not interested in learning geography, and that's fine. And so that we don't say, oh, that's fine. We say, one, you're going to flunk out. Two, we say you're going to be a burden on society, right? You're not just dragging down yourself, which is bad enough. You're wasting your life. You're not making something of yourself. You're actually a threat to society because you're going to be a burden. You're going to slow the rest of us down, and we're trying to build the city on the hill. And we can't build it if we have a bunch of slothful people. And so they actually say this about kids. It always cracks me up, which also, again, cracks me up, but also find terrifying. It's like, we got to prepare them to compete in a global economy. Like, this is what our education system needs to compete. Like, what? What are you talking about? Why? Who's this good for? This is not about them. Notice, very important. It's not about them. It's about the shining city on the hill. If we're going to make a world in which our city on the hill is shining and powerful and the example to everybody else, then the best thing is to train them, whether they want to be trained or not, to compete in a global economy, whether they want to compete or not. We're not giving them options. This is not a choice. Like, they're just going to have to compete. What if they say, we don't want to compete? And maybe other people in the globe don't want to compete. So we're going to train our kids to hang out and smoke cigarettes in the global economy, right? Can we do that? We're going to teach them to drink wine and enjoy themselves and play guitars in the global economy. It's like, right? Like, you can't do that because that threatens the whole system. Witches, right? It's not about a moral failing. And so this whole system takes simple personal things that would be simple personal choices, and it makes them absolute threats to civilization, to the global order, to your shining city on the hill. And so people have this like, this constant drive in the U.S. to improve yourself. Why? You're worthy, you're fine, you're great, you're wonderful. Just be your wonderful self. Don't worry about the rest of it. Just be wonderful. Like, be fabulous. Let's try and be fabulous. Let's try to be a burden on society. How much of a burden on society can we be? Like, just ask these kinds of questions. But no, we want to improve ourselves. We make ourselves better so that we can be elect and we can be worthy. We can, if we get up early and attack the day, by the way, this is the Calvinist doctrine, rising early, working hard, right? All this stuff, it's so pure. It's just fucking Calvinism. It just kills me. And then when you make money, you're doing it right because this proves that you are somebody who is worthy and you've made it. And by the way, this is why losing a job is so catastrophic, because it doesn't tell you like, oh, the company shut down, some director of the company messed up and embezzled money or blew it all in the stock market, or some competition came along. But no, you've no longer a member of the elect because you have no way of proving that you're a valuable, hardworking, member of society, and your neighbors are going to look at you and glance through the curtains like, oh my God, everyone's going to know that I'm worthless now. I need to get back to work to make myself have worth again. And I was like, yeah, well, wow. That again, even if you've never been to church, is just telling you all these concepts are really strongly emphasized and come to us in the United States through the Calvinist tradition. And that doctrine and the Puritan carrying it on and the transmogrification into the wealth doctrine, all this stuff, it reinforces individualism, it reinforces our sense of wealth, but it also reinforces this sort of sense of self-poisoning where any error is a complete elimination of all your value, right? Do 99 things, quote unquote, right, one thing wrong, and you're done, right? Like that is it. Now you're going to be smoted by the wrath of God or the wrath of your community or whatever it is. I think now it's just this vague, probably easier to deal with when you thought, oh, it's just God. Maybe I can pray a bunch and God. Well, if you don't have a God, now you're just faced with this amorphous dread, right, that you can't put a name to, but you know you've pissed something off in the universe, and how do you balance it back out? So, Calvinism in America, it took what probably would have been nascent elements of individualism and materialism just because, again, of the patterns of American history, and it combined with all of that to create this crazy, like moralistic, right and wrong, overheated sense of the need to achieve, a need to be seen achieving, a need to strive and struggle, and to be in pain and to grind and grit, and like all these words that we use to describe people who are doing good things is really just Calvinism trying to fit itself into a world that increasingly it doesn't fit that well in. And I think it's driving basically people a little bit crazy. So, Calvinism in America, thank you very much.